Welcome, everyone. I'm Mary Martin. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Alliances here at Surescripts, and I'm going to be your host today. Today, we're going to be discussing the challenges and frustrations associated with the antiquated process of manual prior authorizations. We're going to explore how digitizing that process can significantly reduce time, processing time, reduce costs, and medication delays. And I'm thrilled to have a number of folks joining me today in the discussion. Mandi Bishop, co-founder of Aloha Health and digital health advocate. I understand the congrats is in order in a recent win, so congrats.
Thank you.
Dr. Ryan Neuhofel, or Dr. New. He's a primary care clinician and a member of the American Academy of Family Physicians. And I have my colleague here with me, Luke Forster-Broten. He's our product manager for our electronic prior authorization solution and capability here at Surescripts. So thank you all for joining us today. Feel free, for those of you that are on and joined, to add questions in the Q&A area. We're going to go probably about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So let's get started. So I'm going to start at kind of at a high level, just kind of a PA or prior authorization sort of overview. What's the current snapshot? So I'll put these both to you, Mandi, first, and then Dr. New. So what's the current PA landscape? How's it work? Who's involved? Where is it not working? And why is it so challenging for both providers and patients?
Sure.
Mandi?
So when I think about prior authorization, it's really needing permission from your insurance company in order to have a procedure performed or to get a medication for any condition that you have, right? So prior authorization is required from your insurer before they will pay for some portion of your drug, or before they will pay for something, say a surgery or a referral to a particular type of treatment facility. So it can be really challenging as a patient because the prior authorization rules are not explicitly laid out in plain English and available for you as a patient to understand. And this is problematic not just from a patient perspective, but because the prior authorization rules are frequently in a black box, and they are dictated by things like medical necessity, which isn't necessarily clearly spelled out how to achieve medical necessity from a provider perspective. It can be very time consuming to get prior authorization for procedures and for medications. So that's kind of what makes it a real pain in the tail for patients as well as for providers. The timely access to the decisions and the business rules that guide those decisions, as well as being able to understand how all of that clinical language applies to you as a patient and applies to your condition and your need for a procedure or for a medication.
And do we see that process, getting better or getting worse with the conditions and the regulatory kind of environment that we're in? I know a lot of providers that I talk to, they essentially want them to go away.
Yeah. Well, it's prior authorization serves a purpose, right? So as we talk about value in this move from fee-for-service to value-based care, part of value is being able to make sure that you are creating an environment where tests that are not necessary are not performed, right? Where procedures that are not going to be effective are not performed. So there is a need for prior authorization. There's a need for us to validate these tests and these medications and make sure that they are going to be helpful to the patient and not harmful to the patient or to the population of patients who exhibit these conditions. But the fact that there's very limited standardization of prior authorization, there's also very vague rules for requesting exemptions or exceptions, right? So if you're a patient who has tried X, Y, and Z things, or if you're a patient whose physiology makes a typical care plan impossible, or whose religion makes a typical care plan impossible, it's very challenging to get exceptions and exemptions for these processes. So it continues to get more challenging as we move towards value-based care, because there's a lot more regulation around it, and certainly things like the privatization of Medicare are going to make that even more potentially more challenging, because the standards that exist for Medicare and Medicaid patients may, as we move towards privatization, the standards may be removed, and we might be talking again about a local standardization that's not going to be universally applicable. Yeah.
Dr. New, how does it affect the provider time and sort of your costs and burden that you have or your staff have?
Well, Mandi did a great job of kind of describing the process, and I think you know, becoming a doctor in practice of medicine is really, really hard. I mean, that's why we have to spend 25,000 hours or so to become a physician. And so I think that's the difficulty for physicians is although certainly physicians sometimes make decisions that aren't evidence-based. Sometimes you know, everything doesn't fit into a perfect box. And there's always exceptions to the rule most of the time. So I think that's where the angst comes from physicians is, you know, we're trying to do the best that we can for our patients and trying to use, most of us at least, are trying to practice evidence-based medicine. But we often find that even though the need is very clear, and that's the video I made, which went viral, you know, I picked to record that one because it was such a you know, a no duh decision. It was like, why did that need, you know, all of those hoops? And doctors run into that every day, where there's a clear and obvious medical need that if I was speaking to another physician, you know, even someone maybe who had a specialty in that area, no one would refute that. It would take 2 seconds of a conversation. But the problem is even those easy decisions, it seems like, and I haven't been in medicine that long, but it seems like even in the past 5 years that they have become increasingly difficult to get approved. And so I think that's where, you know, that's where the angst among physicians and the frustrations rises. And it seems like just more and more things need prior approval. I've heard of stories of things like, you know, a lipid panel on a diabetic needed a prior approval because it was being done a month before it was scheduled to be done. You know, because the patient was there 11 months, but they weren't, you know, due to get it to 12 months, and the patient was there for something else, and the doctor was trying to do, you know, what was very appropriate. Say, oh, well, let's just get your lab now, and the insurance company said, well, you know, lipids panels cost $5 or $10 or maybe $20 in the insurance world. But you know, so even things like that seem to be increasingly common, where it's trivial stuff that requires, you know, a mountain of paperwork and time.
Mandi, you're a big patient advocate. What you know, how would you describe the current snapshot, if you will, around patient satisfaction and expectations around this current process?
Oh, it's abysmal, right? And so we actually, I just did a Monty Python-esque skit about prior authorization and the prior authorization failures. That was, you know, one part of our skit at this recent conference in New York. I mean, it really is. It's a tragic comedy, right? It is so bad that you have to laugh. But unfortunately, people are dying. So people die as a result of these informations and the decisions not being made in a timely manner, the rules about the decisions not being made available in real time or not being made available in a way that makes sense, and those rules themselves not being flexible, not being sensical, as Dr. Neu just alluded to. The fact that if that patient, a diabetic patient, needed a lipid panel, needed to understand where they were before they go on vacation, for example. So if they needed to have it done at 11 months because they were already in for their physician's visit, they've already paid for the office visit. You know, it's perfectly acceptable to have tests ordered during that same visit. However, you know, because of the prior authorization rules that are very rigid, that wasn't able to happen. And so that patient, for example, might have gone on vacation and had been about to have a crisis that could have been averted or could have been recognized if these prior authorization rules were a little bit better understood and were a little bit, and if the information for them were available in the EHR, for example, and much more readily accessible so that we could make decisions quickly. And so that the physicians could share those decisions with the patients, and patients would understand why these decisions are being made. Because that's the biggest pain point and frustration for patients is there is no understanding of why these decisions are made. You know, most of the time they're prescribed a drug, for example, and you go to the pharmacy and you go to pick it up from the pharmacy, and suddenly you're told that drug isn't on your formulary, right? You're suddenly told while you're there, while you've had your appointment, your doctor's prescribed a medication, they've told you about why this is going to work for them, and you go and pick it up and discover that this isn't working. So you've wasted time and energy, and honestly, you've lost a little bit of hope. So you lose a little bit of your soul every time that happens. It's very frustrating for patients.
Well, doctors often don't understand it, so I can't even imagine how patients could understand it.
Exactly.
The topic of real-time data availability is something that I wanted to hit on, and so I think now is a good time. So specifically looking at medication management and scripts, and I'll throw this one to Luke, vis-a-vis the technology, why is real-time data availability so important to the PA process?
Mm-hmm. So I think the biggest reason why it's important is that in the past, a doctor might know that a prior authorization is needed, but she couldn't really do anything about it, right? So she might see a flag in her formulary that says this might require prior authorization, but that's all she had. So she would just have to send the patient to the pharmacy and hope for the best. So I think doctors want to have these conversations. There have been studies that show that if doctors can have real-time data that's patient-specific, that tells them what's the actual copay, does it need prior authorization, is it on the formulary? They want to have those conversations, but right now they can't because either the data is not there or the data is there, but it's at the patient's group level or plan level. And so they just have no way of knowing, am I going to be having a conversation with my patient that's based on their actual benefit? And if they can't do that, then either they risk telling the patient something that's incorrect, and then the patient gets to the pharmacy, like Mandi says, and has a bad experience, or they just don't have that conversation at all, and then the patient's completely in the dark. So having real-time data that's patient-specific at the point of care is crucial, and electronic prior authorization gets you part of the way there in the way that a fully real-time benefit check is kind of the ultimate solution, but EPA is a good first step.
Good. All right, so where should we go from here? Since we're talking a little bit about electronic prior authorization, I guess I'll ask Mandi kind of what are the opportunities in the ripest areas for innovation for prior authorization. And then I guess I'd like Luke to think about maybe just talking a little bit about what we're seeing or the benefits that the electronic prior authorization from a medication perspective is what we're seeing today. So Mandi?
So I think that what Luke just alluded to and what we just talked about, the real-time data being available at point of care so that a physician can have a meaningful conversation with their patient about the drugs that are available to them on their formulary, what is available, what's specific to you, what's going to be available for you with your condition, as well as here's a stretch opportunity, being able to introduce, I think the next step, the next frontier would be being able to introduce a request for an exception or an exemption and being able to include that with your electronic prior authorization. Because it's one thing to understand the rules, and we're still by far, you're ways away from adoption of e-prior authorization, I think, on a grand scale, in part because those rules have not yet been systematically made available by all the insurers, right? So it's not just the formulary and the benefits in that formulary, but it's at the individual level, what medical necessity means per condition, per plan. It's very complex, the prior authorization space. But I think once that adoption has increased to the point where it's mass available, being able to introduce that opportunity for exception and exemption applications and understanding that each patient is not, every diabetic patient is not the same, right? Every CHF patient is not the same. Every COPD patient is not the same. The drug mix is going to be different. Their lifestyle is going to be different. Their ability to manage their care is going to be different. And so being able to not just widely adopt the e-prior auth, but then to couple that e-prior auth with a request for an exemption or exception, I think is going to be the next frontier.
And Luke, knowing that we're in the early stages, maybe you can share just a little bit about the adoption and some of the benefits that the healthcare providers are seeing out there today.
Yeah, definitely. I think so. As Mandi said, it's definitely not being adopted on a grand scale quite yet. So all of the EHRs in the industry obviously have a ton of priorities, whether it's regulatory on a state level or federal level. So they've got all of those things to meet. And then in addition, we're saying we've got EPA, it's out there now, and you can adopt this. And so we've been working really hard to try and get all of the major EMRs to start rolling this out to their users. And that's going to take time, but from what we've seen so far, we're already getting really tremendous feedback from providers. Part of the reason is that when your EMR is electronically connected to the PBM, it enables you to see things much more quickly than you are if you have to go out to a portal and do the prior authorization there or do it via phone or fax. So having that direct electronic connection makes you, during the e-prescribing process, able to send the request to the PBM that says, for this patient, does this drug require prior authorization? And within 3 to 4 seconds, they'll respond back and say, yes, it does, here are the criteria, or no, it doesn't. And what that really enables the provider to do is to start setting the expectation with the patient. So if they know that a prior authorization is needed, they can say, okay, I want to pick a different drug, or I want to pursue this drug, but they can tell the patient, don't go to the pharmacy right away. This might take an hour or 2 hours. So the patient doesn't waste that trip, and then on their after visit summary, they can have that on there with not only here's what we prescribed to you, but it needs a prior authorization and we'll call you when it's ready. And so, and if they decide to fill out those questions during the prescribing process, if it's going to be approved, they get very quick turnaround. So 60% of approvals come back in under 1 minute. So if the doctor or somebody in the back office staff is really on top of it and they're filling out those criteria right away, they can get a quick turnaround and can oftentimes get that prior authorization completed before the patient even leaves the office, which is something that you would never be able to do with a manual or a fax or a portal-based solution.
Dr. Neu, how does this sound in terms of
well, it sounds like the technological hurdles are huge, just because the wide degree of situations, scenarios that occur, and I guess it's easy to say, well, just give an option for an exception, but I mean, I would just choose exception every time and say, well, because I say so. So I wouldn't do the other 18 check boxes they made me do. But no, I mean, I haven't used electronic PAs yet. I haven't experienced them. But I mean, it sounds great. But I think the big concern from providers would be is we're already, those of us who are billing insurance, we're already very much burdened in those documentation requirements. And so even just the fact of ERX right now, some do it better than others with less clicks, but it's adding maybe double the amount of clicks. And so, I think that would be the big concern from the provider standpoint is that, yeah, I mean, a minute doesn't sound like that much, but when, the way that our system works, when you have 10 or 12 minutes with a patient, and it already does take, 5 minutes to document and get the medicine prescribed and everything, I think that would be the big concern is, although it seems, automated, that there is someone on the other end of that who's taking that minute or two. And even though it might be easy, if we end up doing that more often, and every time I prescribe a medicine, I have to get a prior auth for amlodipine because people are now saying, well, we need to make sure that they really need that amlodipine for $4 a month. So if there was a further adoption of PAs because it was now easier, that in some ways for providers that might backfire.
Well, and I think about that, and I think that maybe an opportunity space there is for smart EPA, and not just smart EPA, but then step EPA, being able to do the step prior auth, right? So where you have to examine the medical history and the medication history of your patient, and to be able to have the, if the prior authorization requires attachments, for example, that prove that you have tried X, Y, and Z medications before, that the technology can become smart enough that it can go ahead and call that information, curate that information out of the patient's records without having to incorporate these additional 16 clicks, right? Without the doctor having to intervene. And so that's where technology can be helpful and can certainly increase the opportunity for the physicians. But right now, if
data standards evolved, I mean, if FHIR, evolves and that really does become a true universally used data standard, then I mean, hopefully that would be automated to the point where, but a lot of people, when they say automated, what ends up happening is the doctors and the nurses click a lot. And to us, that doesn't really automation. So if when I prescribed, if it just automatically cross-referenced their medical history and most recent labs, and I mean, that all sounds amazing, but I mean, I think the data standard's a little ways off from actually being able to do that.
Yeah, this is where we need to talk about that national HIE again as well, right? Where we can actually have all of the information across, for a patient at a longitudinal level across every single one of the payers that they've ever interacted with, all their providers.
A diabetes medicine, they make me type in. You're going to have providers putting their heads through the screen.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Good for hardware vendors. Good for hardware vendors.
Well,
they break keyboards a lot.
We've got a couple of questions that have come in on the Q&A. So let me have the group take a stab at these. I think they might be primarily for Luke, and then we'll get back to some of the other questions. But one, I'll give them both to you, Luke. And so one was sort of, what insurance participates in an electronic prior authorization program, and which ones don't? And then would this solution or, kind of expedite the appeal process as well? If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, definitely. So Speaking specifically about the Surescripts complete EPA solution, we support 100% of insurances. So we do that in two ways. One is fully electronically. So the PBMs that are currently certified on complete EPA cover about 85% of the covered lives in the nation. And then the other 15% are covered by a partner of ours, PDR, and they provide a PA form electronically when the fully electronic criteria is not available, because that's really important to provide full coverage. So if it's not a direct connection with the PBM, we have a secondary method that we can get the provider the right form. And then as far as appeals go, that's one of the great parts about the current EPA standard is that it does support appeals. So in the last year, the PBMs that have started to implement EPA have focused mainly on automating and doing the actual prior authorization process proper. But now as we move into 2017, we are starting to see more PBMs think about how do we incorporate our appeal process into EPA so we can get the right information from the provider and expedite that appeal process in a way that they're currently doing with the prior authorization process. So appeals are definitely an important part of the overall picture, and we're starting to see some movement and some adoption there as well.
Mandi, there's been some states that that have had legislative language around sort of EPA. What are some of your thoughts on just, the existing states out there, how well they're doing potentially with some of those mandates and just potential policy changes that you see might be coming down the pike in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think that in talking about the state mandates for EPA, or where the language is certainly encouraging EPA, take a state like New York, right, that recently mandated e-prescribing even. So at a bare minimum, they've mandated e-prescribing, which would be kind of a prerequisite for EPA for medication, right? But even though it is mandated in the state of New York, only about 57% of the physicians were ready to do electronic prescribing because their EHR implementations had not been completed, like they hadn't adopted all of the processes in place. So even though they have a mandate that they have to use e-prescribing, which would, be a prereq for EPA, they're not able to comply. So there's a tremendous amount of pressure on physicians, and Dr. New, you can probably speak to this, but there's a tremendous amount of pressure on physicians to keep up with the Joneses, right? To be able to keep up with these mandates, kind of an endless series of mandates that are helpful in the long term. So if you take a long view in the next 5 to 10 years, if we were able to implement everything that's thrown at us, it would certainly be helpful to us in the long run. But when you talk to an independent general practitioner, or you talk to kind of a small group office, their human and technological resource capability to be able to respond to these new mandates and to be able to constantly be upgrading and integrating new systems and processes. It's not just the technology, but it's the process, it's the workflow, and it's being able to retrain your staff, and it's being able to make sure that you hire people who understand how to do this. Those challenges are huge. So I think in the states where it's been mandated, there's still a tremendous amount of lag time between that mandate. I think New York mandated e-prescribing last year at the end of 2015, and here we are a year later, and we're still only at like the 50% mark where that e-prescribing has adoption has been reached. So there's a huge challenge there, and that dearth between the haves and the have-nots from a technology perspective is what's creating the gap in opportunity for us to fully leverage these types of technologies.
Yeah, I would agree. Luke, anything to add? I mean, I think we did a survey about sort of prior authorization and, where does it fit with being a burden and being a priority, and both on the provider side, over 80% that, and it might've been their staff too, that said it was a priority for them to add that capability into their office. They also agreed, or strongly agreed, that their EHR should provide the functionality. And so I think the provider challenges and understanding what's hindering the adoption, I think Mandi did a great job. Luke, you might want to just comment a little bit on what we're seeing with our EHRs too, in terms of their ability to integrate it into their workflow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's certainly an important capability that all of the major EHRs in the country want to start rolling out to their physicians, but like Mandi said, there's so many mandates on them that until EPA has a similar mandate, it has to fall lower in their priority scale than we might want it to. So that's certainly what we've seen in 2016. So we've had quite a few major EHRs start to roll this out, but there's still some work to be done there as well. And I think that the state mandates, depending on how they're written, there are a lot of different variables and who they put the onus on and what they consider EPA. But if they're written well and they do things the right way, we've certainly seen that be a huge driver of adoption. In Minnesota, which doesn't even have a great amount of teeth in the law, we still saw a tremendous uptick at the end of 2015 and going through 2016 in Minnesota health systems.
Well, and there's huge business value. So if you're given an opportunity to prioritize, I would think that e-prior authorization would be pretty high on your list, because your staff likely spends an inordinate amount of time dealing with manual prior authorizations, like both for medicines as well as for procedures. But it's a huge amount of their time, and these are clinicians who should be able to, practice at the highest use of their licensure, and we're having them as data entry technicians on the phone, with the insurers trying to deal with these manual prior auth processes. So I think that the value proposition is there and tremendously high, but unfortunately it's, they're so pressed for everything else that's necessary that's outside of the practice of medicine, right? So the clinicians are not practicing medicine, they're focusing on these types of issues and by being able to prioritize technology and workflow considerations as opposed to being able to just continuously practice medicine. And it's a challenge that I don't think is going to be resolved anytime in the next 10 years. It'll continue to be a struggle for us. I hope, yeah, Dr. New, I really hope not. I want the world to get better.
I don't want to get too philosophical here, but I think the real underlying question is what processes are necessary. There's certain processes that are necessary, and that's where technology comes in. But you can't have a terrible process and then just presume that technology can always solve it.
Right.
So that's getting a little bit higher level. But yeah, I think from physician standpoint, the reason physicians are skeptical, I'm a huge tech nerd, and most doctors I know, maybe not all doctors over age 60, but the vast majority of doctors use technology like everyone else in our lives. It's not that we hate computers or technology or, we play with our iPads on, at home all the time. It's just that I think physicians feel like, people who are practice managers and involved in physician practices feel like, we've kind of been duped or burned so many times with, this or that regulation that then, like meaningful use, for example, we're not going to do that anymore. And there were people who were already preparing for stage 2 and 3, and then all of a sudden, okay, never mind, let's just scrap that. And so I think that's, there's obviously some resources, person and financial resources to go into it. So the reason that I think that a lot of practices are reluctant to adopt these things is because, they're going to invest all this time and money, and then who knows next year what someone else, a new administration or whoever else, we're not going to do that anymore. And so, from a business standpoint, that's very hard to kind of swallow that. And once you have your kind of processes down and you have your staff trained, it's very difficult from a business standpoint to just change that when you think, a year from now, it might be totally different. So,
yeah, that's a big consideration. There's a couple questions. I think I can probably answer them. One is around how involved is the build to integrate the EPA into our Epic EMR. So you're an Epic site, you can either contact your Epic TS or contact a account manager at Surescripts. We're probably contracted with you, so feel free to reach out to them. If not, you can reach out to me and I can get you connected. There was another question about where they could find the survey results that I just mentioned. And as a follow-up to this live chat, the link to the survey results will be put in there as well. Okay. Can everybody see that? Okay. So we're up about 1:30. Any final comments? Any sort of observations? Anything that I didn't cover that you'd want to share with the group today?
I just talking about prior authorization in general and the need for this type of innovation, and certainly the need for adoption and to have that value proposition really well understood. A friend of mine who is a PA at Mayo Clinic documented all of the time, down to the minute, all of the time that she spent on the phone handling prior authorization issues. Now, this was just not specific to medications, but this was medications and procedures. And as a PA in the orthopedics department, she spent 68% of the time that she was at work dealing with prior authorization issues. So 68%. Yes, of this highly skilled clinician's time was spent on the phone dealing with prior authorization. And so if you think about that at scale, and you think about even if your staff are spending 50% of their time, so if your clinical staff is spending 50% of their time on the phone dealing with prior authorization, this is a problem that needs to be solved. And it's not just a problem for you as clinicians, it is hugely a problem for your patients, and there's a tremendous negative impact to your patient population as a result. So this is a problem that needs to be resolved, and EPA is definitely a step in the right direction, and I look forward to it continuing to get traction. Great,
thank you. Anything else?
I think one thing that people don't necessarily realize is that this process often does interfere with the patient physician patient provider relationship. Patients are not as in tune as you guys are most of the time, and they think there's like this simple thing where we just make a phone call and talk to Steve and tell him to approve it. And so I've had many situations where someone needed something done and I told them they needed it done. And they trust my opinion, and then they get the order and the insurance company says, no, you have to do this and this, and the patient expects that to be approved quickly, and so they have difficulty in discussing that. I mean, they can't discuss it with their insurance company of why it's not approved, and so they call us back and say, well, I want this done. I mean, I need it done today, and so there's a lot of angst on the patients, and it really does put a lot of strain on because we're doing our best to advocate for our patients, but I think sometimes that the anger about the PA process does come back to providers, and then we get defensive, and so I've seen that happen where actually like relationships and the third party is kind of creating a unnecessary anger between physicians and providers sometimes, and that's never good either.
It erodes the trust, right? And then you're going to actually see that on your CAP scores, your HCAP scores, and then from the insurer standpoint, they'll see it on their HOS. So there is a direct material revenue impact to all of the actors in the healthcare system if this prior authorization process isn't addressed.
Great. Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and we will talk soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.